I too would like to spend some time talking about the confirmation and the upcoming vote on Judge Neil Gorsuch. And as many of my colleagues have noted, this is certainly one of the most important responsibilities we have in this body to confirm the next Supreme Court justice. Mr. President, as you noted in remarks you gave a few days ago about Judge Gorsuch, he is an exceptionally well-qualified candidate for the U.S. Supreme Court. Let me go briefly into his bio. He, first of all, has a sterling academic reputation and credentials. He graduated from Columbia, Harvard, Oxford. He clerked for 2 Supreme Court justices. He worked at the Justice Department. Very importantly, Mr. President, we're not hearing a lot about it from our colleagues on the other side. He was unanimously confirmed for a U.S. Court of Appeals job for the 10th Circuit in 2006. Senators such as Hillary Clinton, Barack Obama, Joe Biden, all voted for him, as well as many members of the body that we now serve in who are still serving. Many of my colleagues on the other side of the aisle. Mr. President, he is a Westerner. And you know right now that the U.S. Supreme Court, with the possible exception of Justice Kennedy, has no Westerners. And that's very important. Geographical diversity on the court. Right now, my colleague, Senator Murkowski, this morning talked about how the current Supreme Court is really occupied by justices who have spent almost their entire life in the Boston, New York, D.C. corridor. Well, that's not America. That doesn't represent the whole country. Judges in the Western states focus on issues like Native American law, lands issues, oil and gas issues. Very important, certainly for my state of Alaska, to have a judge with those kind of background. But, Mr. President, it's more than the facts on the page that make Judge Gorsuch such a strong candidate for the high court. During the Senate Judiciary Committee hearings last week, his temperament was also tested and his judicial philosophy was articulated. And it was clear during those hearings that Judge Gorsuch will bring a commitment to following the rule of law and that he believes no one, including the President of the United States, should be above the law. He reveres the separation of powers and the fundamental principle that it's the Congress of the United States, not the judiciary, that makes our laws. And he performed exceptionally well. He answered question after question with consistency and displayed a legal philosophy well within the mainstream of judicial thought within the United States. Now, Mr. President, as you know, it's not just members of this body who are talking about Judge Gorsuch and how well qualified he is, but commentators across the country have focused on how qualified Judge Gorsuch is to be our next Supreme Court justice. Let me highlight just a few of these quotes. This is from an editorial from the Chicago Tribune. Quote, "Here is a judge who knows the law and knows the role of the judiciary. He isn't on the bench to make law. He's there to interpret it faithfully. Neil Gorsuch should be confirmed." The Detroit News, quote, "After 2 days of often hostile hearings, Supreme Court nominee Neil Gorsuch is proving himself an even-tempered, deeply knowledgeable nominee who should be confirmed by the United States Senate." The Denver Post said Judge Gorsuch, quote, "possesses the fairness, independence, and open-mindedness necessary to make him a marvelous addition to the Supreme Court." USA Today, their editorial board declared, "Gorsuch merits confirmation. This Supreme Court nominee is qualified within the broad judicial mainstream of America." In fact, Mr. President, we looked to see if there's any major paper across the country or commentators who are opposed to Judge Gorsuch's nomination. It's hard to find any. Hard to find any in any part of the country. 2 former chief judges of the 10th Circuit Court of Appeals, both appointed by different presidents from different parties, stated, Judge Gorsuch represents the best of the judicial tradition in our country. And even one board member of the Liberal American Constitutional Society, who said that he supports Democratic candidates and progressive causes, declared, quote, there is no principled reason to vote no on Judge Gorsuch's confirmation. He received the highest rating from the American Bar Association. And Mr. President, it's not just the ABA. There is a long, long list of different groups across the country, many representing minority groups in America who have supported Judge Gorsuch. The National Congress of American Indians, the Native American Rights Fund, the Hispanic Leadership Fund, the Central Council of Tlingit and Haida Indian Tribes in Alaska. The list goes on and on and on. So, Mr. President, given the broad-based support from the left, from the right, from the center, why would my colleagues on the other side of the aisle threaten the traditions of this institution and not even allow an up or down vote on Judge Gorsuch? Well, I've been listening. I've been listening to see what they're saying. I've been listening to the speeches. And it seems that some of my colleagues are focused on this vague notion of vagueness, literally, vagueness. If you listen to their comments, they talk about Judge Gorsuch's supposed ambiguity, his vagueness, his evasiveness, that he won't answer questions on how he would rule on specific cases. So they're going to oppose him because of this. Well, these are curious and, to be frank, unconvincing reasons to oppose Judge Gorsuch. First, as you know, Mr. President, nominees typically are not expected to say how he or she would rule on future cases. And judicial nominees, whether appointed by Democrat or Republican presidents, have said this repeatedly. Let me provide a quote from a prior nomination hearing by one of our current Supreme Court justices. She stated, quote, because I am and hope to continue to be a judge, it would be wrong for me to say or to preview in this legislative chamber how I would cast my vote on questions the Supreme Court may be called upon to decide. Were I to rehearse here what I would say and how I would reason on such questions, I would be acting injudiciously. That was Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg, what she told the Senate Judiciary Committee in 1993. She continued during her confirmation hearing, a judge sworn to decide impartially can offer no forecasts, no hints, for that would show not only disregard for the specifics of a particular case, it would display disdain for the entire judicial process. Now, many have called this the Ginsburg standard, one that justices have followed in front of the Judiciary Committee during their confirmation hearings, and one that Judge Gorsuch also followed. Indeed, during his hearing, Judge Gorsuch stated that if the president or others had asked such a specific question on how he would rule on a particular case, he stated, quote, I would have walked out of the room. So, Mr. President, my colleagues on the other side of the aisle, they can't have it both ways. They say they want an independent voice on the court, but they are also opposing Judge Gorsuch because he won't tell them how he would rule on certain cases. This is a new standard and an impossible standard to meet. Now, the second reason the vagueness standards of many of my colleagues on the other side of the aisle in their opposition to Judge Gorsuch is unconvincing is that it ignores the fact that this is a judge with a record. They say that he's vague. We're not sure what his views are. Judge Gorsuch has decided roughly 2,700 cases, over 800 of which he authored. There's nothing vague about that. 97% of the time, those cases, he reached a unanimous decision with the other panelists on the 10th Circuit. These are not vague decisions. His judicial philosophy and temperament are on full display in literally tens of thousands of pages of decisions and his own words. There's nothing vague about it. My colleagues can challenge him on his mountain of legal opinions, but please, with all due respect, let's drop the facade that opposing him because of vagueness and they don't know what the issues are is not an argument that has much merit. So despite widespread acclaim from groups across the country representing a broad spectrum of liberals and conservatives, and despite a 10-year concrete record as a judge on the U.S. Court of Appeals, my colleagues on the other side of the aisle appear to want to engage in a partisan filibuster of Judge Gorsuch's nomination. So what exactly does this mean? The language, I admit, can be confusing. Cloture, filibuster, 60-vote threshold. In plain English, what is really going on? Well, it means that the minority leader right now wants to prevent the Senate from having an up or down vote on the merits of this Supreme Court nominee. In other words, no vote ever on the qualifications of Judge Gorsuch. We'll just filibuster it. Now, I've been watching a number of my colleagues come to the floor and talk about what they're planning on doing. And essentially, the minority leader has essentially been saying, hey, we all do this. We're all guilty. Nothing new here. This is just a little bit of payback. This is how this place operates. In many ways, these arguments are almost cavalier in what they're about to do. But we shouldn't buy that. Mr. President, I've been in the Senate only 2 years. A mere blink of an eye compared to others. And I missed a lot of the other nominations and debates in 2013, the Gang of 14 many years ago. But I like to read a lot of history. And here are some facts that it's important to understand as we debate the Gorsuch confirmation. First, there's never been a partisan filibuster of a new president's nominee for the Supreme Court. Never. Second, it has been the custom, always, of the U.S. Senate to give a new president's nominee an up or down vote. For example, Republicans gave this courtesy to President Clinton when he nominated Ruth Bader Ginsburg in 1993 and Stephen Breyer in 1994, and President Obama with his first-term nominees, Sonia Sotomayor in 2009 and Elena Kagan in 2010. All got up or down votes. And third, there has never been a 60-vote requirement for any justice on the Supreme Court during a confirmation process in the U.S. Senate. Never. Let me go through the votes of the current Supreme Court justices. Justice Kennedy, 97-0. Justice Thomas, 52-48. Justice Ginsburg, 96-3. Justice Breyer, 87-9. Chief Justice Roberts, 78-22. Justice Alito, 58-42. Justice Sotomayor, 68-31. Justice Kagan, 63-37. Incidentally, Mr. President, Justice Scalia, who Judge Gorsuch would be replacing, passed with a vote in the U.S. Senate of 98-0. 98-0. Note that 2 of the current members of the Supreme Court were confirmed by fewer than 60 votes. Bottom line, there has never been a 60-vote requirement in the U.S. Senate or a partisan filibuster of a Supreme Court nominee during a president's first term. Never. And here's another fact equally as relevant to Judge Gorsuch's confirmation. More than any other presidential election in recent memory, the one last year was clearly about the United States Supreme Court. Republicans in the Senate and candidate and now President Trump told the American people there's an open seat on the U.S. Supreme Court. This is an important issue. Let the people decide. And they did. Polls show that millions of Americans ended up voting for President Trump and against Hillary Clinton, based at least in part on which candidate they believe should nominate our next Supreme Court justice, and whether they wanted the court to act as a super legislator, interpreting a living constitution, or whether they wanted a justice in the mold of Justice Scalia, with a more modest view of how the court should view its station in our constitutional order. The American people, including my constituents, spoke loudly in November on this issue of the U.S. Supreme Court by voting against Hillary Clinton and for Donald Trump. And to his credit, President Trump kept his word on this important issue by putting forward an extremely well-qualified candidate who will be a worthy successor to Justice Scalia. So despite all this, an extremely well-qualified nominee in a national election that focused on who should fill the vacancy of the Supreme Court, it appears that the minority leader of the United States Senate is going to ignore the will of the American people and Senate precedent dating back to our nation's founding by leading a filibuster against Judge Neil Gorsuch. Mr. President, we shouldn't allow this to happen, and we won't. I hope that my colleagues who are contemplating this will change their minds. Because in going forward with this filibuster, who are they really punishing? They're punishing the American people, as well as undermining the traditions of this body, a body with rules crafted carefully over the last 2 centuries. Mr. President, as I mentioned, we need to work together in this body. In my 2 years in the Senate, I've tried hard to work with my colleagues on bipartisan issues. I've also tried hard to show all of my colleagues the respect they deserve as duly elected senators of this important body. Whatever the outcome of this vote on Judge Gorsuch, I certainly want to make clear that we need to continue respectfully working across the aisle for the sake of our nation. And we need to rebuild trust in the United States Senate. But at the same time, I believe strongly that Judge Gorsuch deserves to get an up or down vote. I certainly encourage my colleagues to bring that vote forward to confirm this exceptionally well-qualified candidate to be our next Supreme Court justice, and the American people deserve as much as well. I yield the floor.